Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Day 3 of History and Systems of Psychology. I hope you had a nice long weekend and that gave you more than ample time to delve into Chapter 1 and look at the intro in a bit more detail. Also, I hope that you did something fun and were relaxing. We are going to go ahead and start off by recapping what we've gone over. First of all, on Thursday, and then we'll back up to Tuesday. I just want to make sure that this information is staying with you and not being lost along the way as we add more information to that. Just a funny, this is my cat Mirabelle when she was younger and smaller. And this weekend, I was working a lot on taking notes for this class, and so she was pretty upset by that. All right, so let's recap and reflect. What I'd like for you to do is either on your computer or in a notebook, write down 3 things from Thursday's discussion that you remember clearly. At the very least, these are bullet points. Ideally, they're bullet points with a bit of detail behind them. I'm going to ask you to write a few things down during class, so just hang on to this paper for a while. Make sure you put your name on it. If you're on your computer, you'll need to email this information to me.
So don't put it on the same paper that you're handing into you? The hard copy as well as the first paper?
I would do that on a different paper.
Okay.
Yeah. How are you? Good. Let's take 2 more minutes. If you have more than 3 things you remember, certainly feel free to write that information down. Okay, take about 30 more seconds. Who would be willing to share one point that they remember from class on Thursday? Yes.
The word barbaric comes from barbar.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the Greeks being kind of like xenophobic. They were very whenever they heard other
People talking, they were like, oh, your language is so ugly. So,
Excellent, and I love that you threw in that word xenophobic, fear of strangers, right? So this idea that their language, they took a great amount of pride, and there was a lot of unity around that language. Other people, in their viewpoint, talked ugly languages, which was barbar, and that's associated with the word barbarian. Excellent, thanks for getting us started.
I remember us talking about like the Hippocratic Oath and like ethics within practice.
Excellent. And like I said in class on Thursday, remember that's Hippocrates, not Hippo, and I'm going to do oath right here. Tell me a little bit about that.
It was just him, well, from what I read further on
Uh-huh.
within it was pretty much like the separation of like religion from medicine and making that definitive factor so that way they understood, you know, it's not like the God's punishing somebody, but to do well within your practice more or less, but yeah, I wrote further on that one.
Excellent. So he was known for being different from most other physicians in that he did not view disease as something that was an affliction from the gods, all right? You are sick, you are unhealthy, and that comes from the gods and you can't do anything about it. He said, wait up, you know, there's something to be said for looking at someone and carefully examining the person. So this idea that there were reasons for disease, and he did a really good job examining those reasons. Anyone else want to add on? So the Hippocratic Oath, what's our takeaway from that? Do no
Harm.
do no harm. So physicians are still required to take this oath. Ideally, not only are physicians doing no harm, but they are also, their practices are benefiting the people they work with. Other ideas?
the 4 viewers.
Okay, you want to tell me what those are?
Phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, blood.
Excellent. This was part of the humoral theory, right? And what needed to happen in regard to those those 4 humors?
To be in balance.
They needed to be in balance. Excellent. What else?
Just remember the Hippocrates, the systematic observation, just to basically just kind of on a humoral theory, but the systematic observation led to, you know, tried and proven treatments, not just, oh, well, this person uses this person uses that. Standing back, looking at the empirical evidence, saying, hey, just let me look at the facts, let me see what works. And then
Exactly.
recording what works and using what works.
Being able to step back and take that wider vantage point. And he also researched a lot in terms of medicinal herbs, things of that nature. Not only did he take time with the patients to really pinpoint what was going on and what was the root of what's going on, but then also how can we treat that? And there was a very systematic approach to that. Other items you remember? We can go outside of Hippocrates. Yes.
The psyche, it's a term for breath, and some people thought that all things had a psyche, and that's how like different classifications were.
Excellent. This idea that psyche equals breath, and animate objects had psyches because they were breathing, right? And inanimate objects did not because they weren't breathing. Over time, what did that word turn into? Do you remember?
Soul.
And then what? Exactly, very good. Hence the word psychology, study of the mind. Excellent. One or two more additions to our list. I'm looking this way if anyone has something they'd like to share.
I said Thales was a philosopher who believed that water was the most important element.
Excellent.
He fell into a well.
Yes. The infamous well theory. He was an astronomer, right? And he believed that water was the most important element in the cosmos. This was back in the day when elements were talked a lot about, right? And as an aside, he is known partly for the well incident, which is that he was looking up toward the cosmos, as one might do if one was an astronomer, especially back then, and fell into a well. Okay, thank you. Very important tidbit for us to take with us. Good. Yes.
The sophist imparted wisdom to others, and how Sophia, the name Sophia, means wisdom.
Very good. And we're going to talk much more about the sophists, starting with Socrates today. These were people who imparted wisdom. And this literally means wisdom. Anything else you'd like to add? I feel like that gives us a really good jump start on today. I appreciate those that commented. All right, want to go over some items from the introduction. You may want to jot this down in your notes. For the exam, you'll need to talk about the importance of history, why it's important to study history. And I believe we spent some time reviewing that on Thursday. Additionally, you'll need to be able to articulate why it's important to study the history of psychology. And finally, you'll want to be familiar with the different ways of studying history. We talked at length in class on Tuesday and a bit on Thursday that the way you approach the writing or presentation of history is going to make a big difference in how it's viewed by others, right? Excellent. Anything else to add from the content in our introduction or chapter 1? All right, we will move forward. But we will stay on this slide. Any willing volunteers who would like to share a bit of your reflection papers? Okay.
So, Avicenna was an Arabic philosopher who lived in modern day Uzbekistan and Iran from the years of 980 to 1037. He was heavily influenced by Aristotle and Hippocrates when it came to his views on medicine. He believed that a systemic and empirical approach to medicine was the best practice. He published work on hundreds of disease processes and tested and proven ways to treat them. His idea that treatments aren't fixed or static and could always be improved upon are ideas that persist in modern medicine and in the mental health care field. I eventually hope to be a therapist. My desire is to work with first responders. In doing that, I will need to stand on the shoulders of those that came before me and noticed the correlations between types of stimuli and our psychological responses, sought to understand the why behind those responses, and worked to develop effective treatment modalities to help the affected individuals. But according to Avicenna's beliefs that just because established treatment modalities are effective, that they aren't the only ones, we must always be open to think that what we think we know might change based on new information. To put it another way, that the established best practice of how to provide therapy might change according to new research. So I must be willing to change also.
Excellent. Very well put. And I love that you're thinking that way as a future therapist. We can think about therapy as a practice, and that's going outside the realm of my education, but I know a little bit about it. just from my colleagues and from listening to all of you who are community counseling majors in particular. We can think back to CBT, which is what?
Cognitive behavioral therapy.
Cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's been used with a lot of success, right? However, when PTSD was established as a disorder, people wanted to treat it the same way. And they were noticing, van der Kolk in particular, that this treatment method was ineffective. Instead of people being able to process their PTSD and move on, they were in this constant loop of remembering, revisiting, and having those emotional feelings when that happened. Van der Kolk was a pioneer in terms of understanding that a lot of times when we have trauma, it's very deep-seated in almost a reptilian brain. And when it's like that, talking doesn't do a lot. He wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score, where he discusses methods of releasing those memories in a safe way and the use of movement to do that. And that is now something called somatic therapy. Soma means body, using the breath, using movement to help unlock things that are deep-rooted, and then getting to the point where maybe you can start to incorporate CBT, right? Excellent. How about one more share?
I'll read mine.
Okay.
Whatever. For this assignment, I chose Hippocrates, also known as the father of medicine. Hippocrates was a famous Greek philosopher and physician, gaining much recognition for his lasting contributions to the field of medicine. He was the first to separate medicine from religion and establish there is a balance through our lifestyles that in turn determine our fate with diseases and overall health. He believed that healthy food, exercise, and essentially caring for our mental health was creating lasting bodies and souls. The importance of his understanding that diseases were not punishments from their gods, but more environmental factors that people were living in, helped put a more grounded and realistic approach towards healing the sick. To this day, the Hippocratic Oath is taken in the medical world to promise to only do good, which many years later after his time is pretty monumental and says a lot about his impact. For the field of work I am pursuing, most of his findings will be beneficial and will guide me. Therapists are trusted with people's mental well-being and should only set forth to do good upon their clients and promise to never intentionally inflict harm. Therapists are also in need of understanding what it means to live a balanced life, one that will benefit their clients to help them live the healthiest life possible. What we feed our bodies, the amount of exercise we engage in, keeping ourselves distant from toxic things can affect our mental health, are all the things we must know in order to help a client, or in order to fully help a client. Without the teachings of Hippocrates, therapy wouldn't be what it is today, and our understanding of true health wouldn't be a thing.
Excellent. And I appreciate you focusing on that holistic element that was so important to Hippocrates. Excellent work. Thank you for those who shared. Before you turn in or email the papers that you've been jotting down some notes on, I'd like for you to write down a muddy point or type a muddy point that you have from your readings. That can be anything from the introduction through chapter 1. Once you've written down your muddy point, if it's on paper, please pass those papers up. And if it's on your computer, please email that to me. Thank you. Also, if you have a typed copy of your reflection, you can go ahead and turn that in as well. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks. Colby, you have everything. Thank you, sir. I'll come back. Thank you. Any other papers back here that I need to have? Your papers. All right. Uh-huh. I'll take your paper. All right. Hopefully you don't have oodles of muddy points. We'll see in a moment. Thank you. I will review the muddy points and make sure that I touch on them at the start of class on Thursday. Okay? All right, moving on to Socrates. Big name in the philosophy world. As with so many of the philosophers and psychologists to come, in this textbook, it's very interesting to me. The author allows us some time to look at how these philosophers, psychologists grew up, what sorts of families they were from, what sorts of influences, what were they introduced to early in their lives, and then how the role sometimes of chance played in what they became interested in studying. All right, so Socrates was born in Athens in 470 BC. Unlike a lot of the people we will study in class, he was not born to an aristocratic family, and his father wasn't a doctor. I say that almost facetiously, but a lot of these people had doctors as fathers back in the day. His father was actually a stonecutter, which was known as a very quote-unquote noble profession, and his mom worked as a midwife. Socrates was a great student as a child. He went off and fought as a soldier for a number of years, and then when he returned from that, followed in his father's footsteps and became a stonecutter, with a whole lot of thoughts swirling around in his head, right? You can only imagine. I'm not sure why they underscore this in our book. In middle age, he married a much younger woman. I don't know how important that information is, but it's included in the book, and had 3 sons. Okay, works as a stonecutter, has a family, and then decides he's going to stop working as a stonecutter and become a sophist. Itinerant teacher, itinerant means traveling teacher. He did that a bit to his wife's chagrin, you can believe, probably, and he offered his services at a very low cost, even free at times. Again, this was really different from the bulk of the sophists. They were paid really good money by these really wealthy people to receive knowledge from these great minds. Socrates had some interesting ideas and views that separated him from so many other people during this time who were in the field of philosophy. First, he saw his role of teacher as akin to his mom's profession, which was a midwife. Rather than simply, I'm going to teach you all of these facts and then you're going to regurgitate them back to me, which is a product way of learning, he wanted students to be focused on the process. The teacher, sophist, helps give birth to reason. This idea of critical thinking was alive and well way back in these times. He helped pupils bring out the knowledge and wisdom already residing in their psyches. This is someone who thought we come to the table, as it were, with knowledge and wisdom. And through life, through being taught, we're able to draw on that knowledge and wisdom and expand from that. He wanted students also to realize what was true and permanent, these long-lasting ideas, philosophies, versus what was temporary and popular. He did this by engaging students in conversations, otherwise known as dialogues. This is a back and forth thing. So again, it's not, if you were a student of Socrates, you weren't passive. You were actively engaged in the learning process and you were actively dialoguing back and forth with Socrates. Sounds like a lot of work, right? But some really a great depth of learning can occur in that situation. Engaging in dialogues encourage students to develop their own innate, otherwise known as inborn capacities for finding truth, rather than passing on to them predetermined ideas or lessons. Any questions on those two slides? All right, you may know this about Socrates, but one famous fact about him is he did not write anything down. This man with so much wisdom about how we should think, how we should learn, wrote nothing down. He believed that writing ideas down represented true ones only partially or imperfectly. How many of you would agree with his idea?
I don't think I have the memory to go back to what I was thinking.
You would have to have a really sharp memory, right?
I wonder if he had an eidetic memory or something like that. Like, was he just able to remember everything?
I have a feeling he probably had that tendency. We'd have to read more about it.
I think it's one of like, I can still remember my best friend's phone number from when I was in junior high.
Mhm.
Because back then I didn't have a cell phone to store it. Now, like, even my mom, dad, like I don't know their phone number, it's in my phone.
Right, right. You can only imagine what Socrates would think about the internet.
I think every.
That'd be a dialogue, right? A really long-winded, you have to sit down with like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, stick on your non-crown, right? And go to business. He also believed that writing weakened the faculties of memory and serious thinking. Lucky for us, we do know quite a bit about Socrates, but we know that secondhand. There's a difference between writing it down yourself, talking about your own ideas, and having it go through a person. And the person was a pretty amazing one in and of himself, Plato, all right? So pretty high up the philosophy chain, as it were. He wrote down Socrates' ideas in the Socratic dialogues. And he used a lot of allegories or stories to get the points of Socrates out to other people. However, to a certain extent, the content in these dialogues is based on how Plato digested Socrates' ideas. What he held on to as important, and maybe there were things that he didn't mention because for himself, he didn't view it as important. So again, we go back to what do we include and what do we leave out of history? Nativism was a concept that's central to Socrates. This is the idea that we're emphasizing inborn qualities as opposed to rationalism. That's emphasizing reason and acquired properties. Socrates did not believe we're born a blank slate. He felt that within us is an innate capacity to learn. We have that already within us. And that's very different than what some other philosophers had to say later. Included within this is the ability to create abstract ideas or complicated math regularities. All right? So you can think of Socrates when you are working on the math regularities. Not surprisingly, Socrates was viewed as a controversial figure. He was also known for looking a little rough when he went out into public. He wandered the streets, toga maybe not always laundered, hair maybe not always finely coiffed. He was not interested in his appearance. We'll just leave it at that. And during that time, people had things to say about just that, his appearance. And, how can this person be a sophist and he's teaching these really wealthy people how to think for themselves? How can we take this person seriously who shows up to the table like this? His ideas had a propensity to stir people up who wanted to remain status quo. It can be kind of dangerous when you start teaching someone how to think on their own, right? Socrates said that the only real wisdom laid in what he didn't know. And you may hear this adage, the more I learn, the less I know. What does that mean?
So, even in modern medicine, like we have, a question. Once we learn enough to know to answer that question, we also learn enough to know that, like, whoa, it's kind of peeking in a library that's dark. Yes, we have access to the one book that we can kind of see in the light, but that also leads us to, 1,000 more books that we didn't even know were there. So it lets us know, yes, we answer one question, but by answering that one question, we learn.
We have all these other questions.
To have 1,000 more questions.
Right. And sometimes when you don't know very much about something, you don't even know the questions to ask, right? I remember being in my doctoral program and really feeling this. I got into it the first year. I thought, wow, I'm learning so much. My knowledge is really growing. Second year was a humbling year, to say the least. I mean, the program was humbling to me as a whole, but I started thinking, wow, I'm learning all these things and learning to think in new ways, but there's so much out there that I have no idea what this is about, or I'm learning these things and now I'm having questions. I didn't have as many questions before. So lots of things going on in that brain. Socrates encouraged people to think for themselves. Like I said, that was something that was met with curiosity for some, and for others, it was seen as dangerous. He was arrested at age 70 for, quote, corrupting youth and committing treason against Athens. He was given a poison, hemlock, and he died from that poison. We're going to watch now. I probably shouldn't have an exclamation point after death, poison. Let's watch. Maybe take that off of this in terms of what you're looking at. Just ignore it. Okay. Uh-oh. No, I don't. What does this say? All right, I'll be back. I need technological assistance. Could you help me open this link? Thank you. Well, the video is not coming up. That is something that I would like for you to watch on your own. It's interesting, and we will have to skip that video discussion since you're going to have to watch it on your own time, but no need to worry. We will talk about it on Thursday. I do want to show you a picture that's very famous. It's called The Death of Socrates. And I don't know if that's any bigger. But that's a very famous painting that we'll also talk about in more detail once you have an opportunity to watch the video. All right, legacy Socrates left for Plato: know thyself and interpret your experiences in light of your own innate rational faculties. He believed we came with a lot of wisdom. We've just got to figure out how to use it. Any questions on Socrates? No, feeling pretty good about it so far, or about him? All right, we are going to jump into the early life of Plato. Unlike Socrates, Plato's father was not a stonecutter, right? His mom was not a midwife. Rather, he was born into an aristocratic family. And we'll say this aristocracy had gone on for several centuries. He studied under Socrates. He could have studied under any sophist. Money was not a problem, but he was drawn to Socrates, as were many of the young intellectuals during that time. Decided, I'm going to study under Socrates, and a lot of his philosophy is based on that study. One core idea that he rejected, however, is the notion of nativism. We've just talked about nativism, and we'll be talking about it a little bit more, and his rejection led him to establish something in that place, so to speak. Once Socrates died, Plato was devastated. He left Athens for several years. And then in his early 30s, he inherited land and established what we know as the academy. When you think of higher institutions of learning, a lot of times that word comes into being. This is a specific, the academy type of thing. He established a place of teaching and learning, and a place where scholars could conduct what we would call scholarly research. It was open to people of all ages, and it was open to people who had diverse viewpoints. Again, this is very different than a lot of things that are going on during those times. The Socratic approach was central to the academy. Again, this idea of questioning what we know, questioning what we don't know was central. But to that was added topics such as math and astronomy. And talked about the fact that many diverse opinions were tolerated. One of many things I find interesting about these early philosophers is that most of them were interested in and had acumen in an array of subjects. They might be one moment they're talking about the psyche, they're talking about idealism, and the next they're talking about mathematics or astronomy, etc. Basically, you see people gifted in a lot of different areas. And it's a little bit different than what we find now. I believe as a society in the U.S., we place a lot of importance on being an expert in the field, rather than having knowledge that is more broad. All right. Instead of nativism, Plato believed in idealism. And before we talk about idealism, I need to define the word appearance. That is the Greek word for phenomenon. According to Plato, appearance referred to our actual conscious experience of something. All right, our real-time conscious experience of something. For example, we see a particular tree or cat. All right, you saw Mirabelle earlier, and my little corny side note about her weekend. We see this particular tree. But lying behind each of these passing experiences, like when you walk by a tree on campus, there's something more permanent, general ideas and forms of all trees and all cats. So for those of you with animals, cats or dogs, when I ask you to think about your cat or dog, something's going to come into mind. But if I were to ask you to think generally about cats and about dogs, most of us would form a more generic version of those animals. Okay? Does that make sense? We can think about a child learning words, learning what things are. The child sees a cat. It's white and furry. And they come to realize that not only is this cat's name Jojo, this is named Jojo, but it's also a cat. And then in comes this furry stuffed animal. And the child says cat or Jojo and is told no. And as a child, that's confusing, right? I thought white furry things were cats, specifically Jojo. And then a dog comes in and the same thing. So we can differentiate, but what a child learns is like the grouping of something. Cats in general, dogs in general. And then there's a specific experience of petting a specific dog. Idealism is the general view that there exists something more fundamental and ultimate lying behind everyday sensory experience. This means that we're not merely these organisms who have little antennas sticking out all over us and we're sopping up what the world has to offer us. There's a little bit more to that. All right, Plato's idea of the psyche. Well, Plato was a product of his time, even though he was ahead of his time in many ways. This slide, I believe, depicts the product of his time idea. Plato's idea of the psyche was that there are three basic components that govern us. The need for physical gratification. According to Freud, this would be getting our base biological needs met. Courage. So this idea that we're driven to be courageous, to accomplish things. And reason, rational mind. Now, Plato said everyone possesses these three components in different proportions, meaning none of us is solely driven by our need for physical gratification or our need for courage or reason. However, he did think that there were different class differences. Let me just say that. Hoi polloi, that's Greek for ordinary person, which we would probably fall into. I know you guys are all special, but Plato might call us hoi polloi. We are governed by our appetites. We have these base impulses and we're going to get those needs met. We know we're way more than that, but he did believe he was a product of his time, and he believed that most people, the masses as he referred to them, are driven by that. Then there was a second class, we're going up one tier, who were governed by courage, and these people were the soldiers. And goodness, if you've watched a movie that is depicted in Greek times, there were a lot of soldiers back in the day, right? And then we have our small minority governed by reason. These were the elite. These were the individuals who were able to hire sophists to teach them. And he saw them not only as elite, but the elite guardians governing society. So we need to take our hoi polloi around and we need to protect them. And we can do that because we're reasonable people. We're not governed by base impulses. We are governed by higher reasoning. Okay, he saw the relative proportions of these three functions as generally fixed. When we talk about nature versus nurture, what does that mean? We're answering, or we're talking about what and what? What?
What we grew up in, environment.
One of those is what we grew up in, which is going to be our nurture, and the other one is nature, what we have genetically, right? He strongly believed in a strong genetic component. You're born, you have hoi polloi parents, you might not say it that way, but you know what I mean. You have ordinary parents, you're gonna be ordinary, and there you go with your appetites, trying to get those needs met. Interestingly, although Plato was the product of a democracy, he didn't necessarily believe it was the best type of government. And that does make sense given the previous slide we were on, right? He didn't feel like everyone could be guardians of the universe, all right? He believed the masses were like prisoners in their thinking. They're either unable to accept wisdom from enlightened ones, or they're unwilling. Neither word paints a flattering picture of the masses. He was more supportive of an oligarchy, society ruled by a few select guardians. We talked about the different types of democracies. Remember that we could have one that was a kingdom ruled by a king, one that was an oligarchy, or we could be ruled by we could be self-governing, okay? I hope this works. Fingers crossed. Okay. I love it when this happens. Yeah, I'm going to try that. I tried it with the other one. Exam question that focuses specifically on this allegory. It's a really prominent one in philosophy.
As I'm in the midst of applying for residency right now, wish me luck, Grammarly has again been a lifesaver with my application in helping me write my personal statement and
what is reality? Knowledge? The meaning of life? Big topics you might tackle figuratively, explaining existence as a journey down a road or across an ocean, a climb, a war, a book, a thread, a game, a window of opportunity, or an all too short-lived flicker of flame. 2,400 years ago, one of history's most famous thinkers said life is like being chained up in a cave, forced to watch shadows flitting across a stone wall. Pretty cheery, right? That's actually what Plato suggested in his Allegory of the Cave, found in Book 7 of the Republic, in which the Greek philosopher envisioned the ideal society by examining concepts like justice, truth, and beauty. In the allegory, a group of prisoners have been confined in a cavern since birth, with no knowledge of the outside world. They are chained facing a wall, unable to turn their heads, while a fire behind them gives off a faint light. Occasionally, people pass by the fire carrying figures of animals and other objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners name and classify these illusions, believing they're perceiving actual entities. Suddenly, one prisoner is freed and brought outside for the first time. The sunlight hurts his eyes, and he finds the new environment disorienting. When told that the things around him are real, while the shadows were mere reflections, he cannot believe it. The shadows appeared much clearer to him, but gradually his eyes adjust until he can look at reflections in the water, at objects directly, and finally at the sun, whose light is the ultimate source of everything he has seen. The prisoner returns to the cave to share his discovery, but he is no longer used to the darkness and has a hard time seeing the shadows on the wall. The other prisoners think the journey has made him stupid and blind and violently resist any attempts to free them. Plato introduces this passage as an analogy of what it's like to be a philosopher trying to educate the public. Most people are not just comfortable in their ignorance, but hostile to anyone who points it out. In fact, the real-life Socrates was sentenced to death by the Athenian government for disrupting the social order, and his student Plato spends much of the Republic disparaging Athenian democracy, while promoting rule by philosopher kings. With the cave parable, Plato may be arguing that the masses are too stubborn and ignorant to govern themselves. But the allegory has captured imaginations for 2,400 years because it can be read in far more ways. Importantly, the allegory is connected to the theory of forms developed in Plato's other dialogues, which holds that, like the shadows on the wall, things in the physical world are flawed reflections of ideal forms, such as roundness or beauty. In this way, the cave leads to many fundamental questions, including the origin of knowledge, the problem of representation, and the nature of reality itself. For theologians, the ideal forms exist in the mind of a creator. For philosophers of language viewing the forms as linguistic concepts, the theory illustrates the problem of grouping concrete things under abstract terms. And others still wonder whether we can really know that the things outside the cave are any more real than the shadows. As we go about our lives, can we be confident in what we think we know? Perhaps one day a glimmer of light may punch a hole in your most basic assumptions. Will you break free to struggle towards the light, even if it costs you your friends and family? Or stick with comfortable and familiar illusions? Truth or habit? Light or shadow? Hard choices, but if it's any consolation, you're not alone. There are lots of us down here.
Takeaways. Who'd like to share?
I thought it was an experiment that he actually performed, like one of the first experiments done.
It was an allegory, it was a story.
Okay. I think in the book they referenced or they acted like it was an inspiration maybe for experiments done. That they were like, like maybe that's why they referenced it, that it was repeatable in that way.
Uh-huh.
Because of like maybe the Stanley prisoner experiment,
Oh, I like the way you're thinking.
the group dynamic.
Uh-huh. So in terms of social
Just the tricking
psychology,
people, yeah. So,
and very replicable,
right, yes, the replicability.
good. Others?
I liked it, it's true.
You liked it, it's true. Can you expand on that?
That people don't like what they already know to be disrupted. They get comfortable in their thoughts, and anything that comes in to, try to challenge it, it's majority of the time, it's not accepted. Like it's scary to them.
Can you share an example, or does someone want to share an example?
It's just any of our values and our beliefs that we already have instilled in us, anything that comes in to try to prove different, it's hard for us. We've already created our biases and things and such.
And as you age, you'll find that becomes more and more fixed. The willingness to be open even to a new way of doing a simple task becomes difficult. As creatures, habit's a big part of our lives, and knowing what to expect and not being surprised by it is something important to many of us. When we think about expanding our minds, being introduced to a new idea that may be in contrast to something we've grown up believing, a lot of what we call cognitive dissonance can occur. And as you go on in your education, I believe one of the most valuable assets will be your willingness to open your mind up to different ways of thinking, different people's perspectives. That being said, it can be a really difficult thing to do. Good comment. Let's hear from someone over here. Colby, do you have anything to add? And then we'll go, I heard another voice, so.
I liked his theory of forms and how things are just a reflection of their ideas.
And the problem that's inherent in categorizing these separate things into one abstract category. Good. Colby, did you have something you'd like to add?
I liked what he said towards the end of the video. He said, can we be confident in what we know and don't know? And saying that's what it's like to be a philosopher.
So I might say, how confident can we be regarding what we know and don't know? That's a really important point to draw from that video. Anything else? Anyone like to elaborate or provide us with a new point?
I think every philosopher just always digs into the general population,
Uh-huh.
I understand for them they have this they genuinely do have a greater form of wisdom in them. It's just it's kind of funny to me that they're always the masses are ignorant and stupid and stubborn. I'm just
Yeah, because they are supposed to be wise. One would think that they might have a more open mind.
I think like any other savant though, where do they lack in some area of knowledge?
Or way of living, right? Socrates had a great depth of knowledge, wonderful ideas, changed the landscape of how we think. But there were other aspects of his life that maybe were not on par with that. As a takeaway, the allegory of the cave illustrates issues that 2,000 years later would loom large in establishing modern scientific psychology. So Jamie, that's where your comment really comes into play nicely. Well, philosophy still matters today. Plato's thought extended into a lot of different topics. We talked about a lot of these people having talents in many different areas or varied interests. Plato's thought extended to a wide variety of topics, as I said, so much so that one influential philosopher called the entire philosophical tradition a series of footnotes to Plato. That's a pretty big statement for someone to make. I'm not sure if we'll be able to view these today. If not, I would like for you to take time to look at them on your own. We might be able to, let's see. Let me do a quick search.
Incredible.
But it was interesting to learn more about the academy and some of the figures there. Famous figures like Aristotle and Eudoxus of Cnidus and Speusippus and people like that, and about Plato's role in the academy. I mean, there's some very, very curious aspects of this. The academy was a teaching school and a research institution. It taught, I think, primarily wealthy late teenagers from Athens itself. They would walk out to where the school was being held in a gymnasium just out in one of the suburbs of Athens and attend lectures, and this was considered and had been considered for some decades a sort of a finishing school, a way for wealthy young men to round off their higher education and be able to put a bit of verve and gloss into their conversation.
Incredible.
But it was interesting to learn more about.
All right. These links, these two links, that was a different one than what I had originally wanted to show should work for you at home. Looks like we have about 10 minutes to cover all things Aristotle related. We won't be able to get there, but you will have some snapshots of the man, the myth, the legend. Well, in 367 BC, 17-year-old Aristotle arrived at the doors of the academy. Those are really special doors that not many people got through. Aristotle was a son of a prominent physician who was family doctor to the Macedonian king. Important job, but still he was not from an aristocratic family. And that's really important for us to take note of. While at the academy, it was quickly seen that he was one of the top pupils. He also became one of its most distinguished scholars. He was there for quite a bit of time. However, around the time of Plato's death, Aristotle was passed over as the academy's new leader. And Aristotle felt pretty strongly that he believed himself to be worthy of leading the academy. And that had to have been soul or psyche crushing for him. As I stated earlier, one reason for this might be because he was not an aristocrat and he was not an Athenian. More importantly, perhaps, is that he was predisposed to place more emphasis than Plato on systematic observation of nature, of the natural empirical world of the senses. And as a reminder, knowing the world empirically means that you are, quote unquote, knowing it through your senses, what you're taking in with your eyes, what you're hearing, what you're feeling. All right, well, he was not given reign over the academy and he left. 12-year odyssey. At this time, he explored the outside real world. He'd spent a lot of years inside those hallowed halls, so now he's out, he's about, he's seeing what's going on in the real world. He became one of the earliest proponents of empiricism. The empirical method to him was the best way of knowing about our world. We'll look at this in class on Thursday. There's a really famous painting called The School of Athens, and it depicts Plato and Aristotle. And we see Plato with his finger pointing up to the sky, and then we see Aristotle with his finger pointing below. And those are some key differences that we will unpack in our next class. He tutored Alexander the Great, or the person who became Alexander the Great, and eventually opened his own school called the Lyceum. The Lyceum, if you've done some of your reading, was known as a peripatetic school. What does peripatetic mean?
Is that the one that was a grove of trees?
So his school was outside. It means walking school. Picture in your mind's eye people out walking around in this grove of trees, thinking deep thoughts, acquiring knowledge, ways of thinking. The surviving ideas of the Lyceum are important to the development of Western psychological thought as a whole. When you think about these philosophers, especially when you look at experimental psychology, we can draw a lot on Aristotle and his ideas. For Aristotle and his protege, knowledge acquisition, so acquiring or gaining knowledge, included two essential steps. We're going to carefully and systematically observe our world. We'll see this later when we talk about Darwin and the way he systematically examined fossils, examined plants, examined animals day in, day out. We're going to observe these different, let's say, plants, and then we're going to classify them into meaningful groups or categories. Early classification of zoological and biological specimen began the fields of taxonomy and arranging organisms in hierarchically ordered groups and subgroups. Anyone familiar with this King's Play cards on fine green silk? Have you heard that before? Okay.
Say it again.
Well, it was on the screen. King's Play cards on fine green silk. That is the way I was taught in zoology when I took it both the first and the second time, after not passing it the first time. It means kingdom, phyla, class, order, family, genus, species. There are other ways to remember it. That's an example of a mnemonic device, finding a clever, we'll put in air quotes, way of remembering something. Anyone have another acronym that they used?
It's usually like King, Philip, King, something.
From something? All right, well, if you think about that one, let us know. Aristotle likened the tissues of our sense organs to the surface of a wax tablet, capable of receiving impressions or imprints from stimuli that strike them. Meaning the world is imprinting on us. And that stimulus leaves an imprint that hopefully replicates its essential features. Something that distinguishes a circle from a square. These are preserved and become the basis of our memory. We encounter something, we see it, that's put into our brains. After that happens, once again, it becomes blank and ready for the reception of new imprints. So we have these collected imprints that occur over time. Aristotle talked at length about the notion of the receptive mind and believed the human psyche has an innate sense of categories, that we as people are hardwired to categorize things. If you think back to 3rd or 4th grade, I would guess that's when science class you were introduced to this in science class. Maybe with dinosaurs, we're gonna classify dinosaurs or different rocks. Did anyone do that? Fun, not fun?
I thought it was fun.
You thought it was fun, okay.
Yeah, I lived in Wyoming at the time, and
Uh-huh.
so my class went and dug for dinosaur fossils when we were learning about them. So it was pretty exciting.
Now that would be really fun. Wow, real world experience out there. Very cool. Who else dug for dinosaur fossils?
I didn't do that, but I think in like kindergarten, they had us collect different leaves from different trees.
Okay,
So
similar. Maybe not quite as exciting, but similar. I remember learning the song, it's a song about a stegosaurus. And I was really interested in the Triceratops. There's a song I remember that goes with that. I will not sing it to you. Maybe on Thursday. But it had to do with Triceratop has 3 long horns. And then something that rhymes with horn. I don't think it was corn, but something. All right, very last thing, and then it's time for us to go. Careful observation of the world is important according to Aristotle, but it's not just the mere accumulation of facts that we're after. We want to do something with the facts. You can know all these things, or you can be introduced to all sorts of facts online, but how many of those can you really explain, and how many of those facts can you do something with? The mind is not passive, but rather an organizer of thought. This is something that I believe was mentioned in one of the videos that we watched, the one on Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates that talked about the scale of nature. And this is where we will start class on Thursday. We have the vegetative souls. Plants, you can think vegetables and remember that. We have the sensitive souls, which would be an example of your family dog or orangutan. And then we have the rational soul, which would be most of us humans. No, I'm making a joke. Humans. All right, if you have any questions, please email those to me. And do go ahead and start reading through chapter 2. We need to finish up. We're going to be looking at some Islamic pioneers that we don't often hear about in the Western world, and how they added to some fundamental ideas